scenarios to set the stage. I want you to imagine living in a country with inflation of more than 133% in a year. Picture arbitrary capital controls forbidding you from sending your money outside, even if it is to pay for your children's university tuition or medical bills. Picture more than 50% of the population around you living below the poverty line. Imagine your politicians being in power for 30 years, yet making money off your back, and none are ever tried. So by now you're probably wondering who I am and why I'm here. I'm a first-year student studying International Social and Public Policy at the London School of Economics, where I'm studying towards a degree to one day make the world a better place, as almost every other person in my course would say. My degree is not what this is about though, so if you just bear with me while I bring in our imaginary scenarios one more time, you'll understand. Imagine all the scenarios I mentioned, and that all of them are real and happening at the same time. You get Lebanon. And while I'm asking you to picture this grim story, for Lebanese people, this is their everyday life, which they would do anything to stop picturing, let alone living. I'm not here to tell you the facts of what happened, but to put a face and personify this story, and hopefully leave you with something to act upon. My senior year began just like any other teenagers, worrying about college acceptances and prom dresses. I expected these worries to subside as the year went along, but instead a pandemic struck, putting the health, lives and livelihoods of myself, my loved ones, and all those around me at risk. Now my worries shifted to the potential of a first year of university being online and the cancelled prom. Little did I know, however, that the worst was yet ahead. The story begins on October 17, 2019, in my last year of high school, when a government proposal to put a tax on WhatsApp caused nationwide anger. $6 is not a lot for you or for me, but just imagine being a Syrian or Palestinian refugee who can't even afford a toothbrush. Imagine WhatsApp being the only way you can keep in touch with your loved ones who fled to Europe against all odds. Or imagine being a Lebanese father who can no longer afford to feed his children. I know these faces. These faces left the youth no choice but to act. Rallying together, students like me and across the country realized that being part of history bested attending history class altogether. And together, students driven by the youth made our voices heard. Marching into the epicenter of revolution, I heard the West Beirut accent, the heavy Southern accent, and many more, all demanding change. The WhatsApp tax was the straw breaking the camel's back, but the populace rallied because of decades of corruption, sectarianism, nepotism, and injustice. Singing our anthem, we carried signs and marched across Beirut. Standing hand in hand with members from 26 different religious communities, differences disappeared. We were standing on the deadly green demarcation line once dividing Christian and Muslim territories in the Civil War of 1975. The war predated me, yet bullet-riddled buildings were a salient reminder of sectarian division. Beirut was strong, so I had to be too. Wearing my flag like a superhero cape filled me with as much joy as the thought of wearing my cap and gown when graduating. I knew that we could not give up. But following several weeks of peaceful protests, corrupt politicians spread unrest, with many even sending their thugs to harass protesters. The violent events unfolding of what started as a peaceful revolution motivated me to want to advocate for change even more. The experience was empowering. I was part of a noble cause hoping to improve the lives of Lebanon's most vulnerable. Over the following days, as protests proved resilient, I, among the rest of the youth, initiated a taboo dialogue. My generation was hardwired to shun political discussion as incendiary. No more though. On social media, our discussion threads gained traction, mobilizing support. Beirut's streets were now more than a site of peaceful protest supporting those in need, but they became the place where I began to see the value of strength. They became the place where I was learning how together we can be powerful, overlook differences, and ultimately make the world a better place, especially since we, the youth, are the leaders of the future. Together, I believed we could be the rays of sunshine the seeds of the revolution needed to bloom. Not long after my epiphany, a big dark cloud loomed over the city that taught me bravery and inspired me to believe that the youth are powerful enough to instigate change. This is a picture of my beloved grandmother, the woman who taught me, my mother, and all my family the true meaning of love, hospitality, and tolerance. And today, I'm standing in her photo gallery room remembering all the memories with her. My grandmother survived bladder cancer, a list of other diseases, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and many more hardships. But on August 15th of this summer, she died from the shock she sustained from August 4th, when Lebanon was rocked by an explosion of more than 200 tons of ammonium nitrate stored unsafely and illegally in Beirut's port exploded, causing at least 204 deaths, 6,500 injuries, $15 billion in property damage, and leaving an estimated 300,000 people homeless. My mother and I were two of the 300,000 people left homeless. She was one of the 6,500 injured, and my beloved grandmother was one of the 204 deaths. And from that day, there will always be an empty seat at the table where my grandmother used to sit because of the negligence, mismanagement, and corruption of Lebanon's political system that allowed for such an atrocity to occur. This is the story of how the 200 tons of ammonium nitrate that was felt more than 200 kilometers away was less than 1 kilometer away from my house, less than 3 kilometers away from where my friends and I were, and less than 5 kilometers away from where I had my first date in a city that was already bleeding due to economic and political injustices. So how was I lucky enough to escape an explosion with approximately 10% the explosive power that the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima had? On August 4th, my friends picked me up, and that day we drove past the port a few times, passing by it for the last time within just half an hour of the explosion, going for dessert. So just imagine I woke up half an hour later that day, or even decided to stay home. I wouldn't be here today telling you this story. At 6:07, we heard an explosion, and the three of us went under the table. At 6:08, another sound, but this time the glass shattered, sirens went off, people were screaming, and blood was splattered everywhere. Looking around us, we were somehow the only ones unhurt. I wasn't as worried as I should have been, because as sad as it is to admit, growing up in Lebanon, no one ever felt too safe. We assumed it was a political bombing near the Houses of Parliament, so I did not presume anything near my house, until I was bombarded with phone calls from friends and family from all over the world asking if I was okay. At this point, I realized something was terribly off and that I should be concerned. I called my house phone, and the frightened voice of an unfamiliar man responded. My first question to him was, "How are you in my house?" To which he replied, "You no longer have a house, dear." Hearing those words sent shivers down my spine, especially as a feeling of helplessness came over me. Just imagine you didn't know where you were sleeping that night. And not only was I worried about myself, but my community. The man explained to me how our domestic workers were fine, as they were helping my grandmother who was visiting us in the bathroom, which happened to be the one part of the house with no damage. What next, I wondered? My mother was not answering, and I had no idea where she was, let alone if she was dead or alive, and I had no other family members in Lebanon to help. After relentlessly calling my mom, she finally picked up. Hearing her voice almost brought me to tears, but I knew that now was not the right time to be weak. She told me she was at the gym when the glass window fell onto her, breaking her arm in 2 places and puncturing her in several places with glass shards. Hospitals in Beirut were either already overflowing or they had been blown up, so my mom had to go outside Beirut. So, what is an 18-year-old meant to do when her mother is in hospital, her dad lives abroad, and the country is absolutely destructed? Just sit tight? Not only did I sit tight, but I made sure to keep a strong face for my family, who needed me now more than ever to be strong. From the age of 4, when the Israelis bombed the lighthouse 1 kilometer away from my house at the time, I have been routinely living with political assassinations and terrorist attacks haunting Lebanon. This environment instilled fearlessness in me. Evacuating my grandmother out of the house was another obstacle because of the lack of electricity and all the fallen items. Imagine your worries changing within the span of 1 minute from what Instagram filters to use to the safety of your family and country. It was hard being responsible and acting like a grown-up when I was still just 18 years old. It was hard sleeping that night in my friend's house, knowing my mother had injured herself, my grandmother lived through that, and the house was completely ruined and exposed to looting and robbery. The coming days did not get easier, but I did not give up. The first day after the blast, I went to my home alone and climbed over piles of glass, aluminum, wood, and so many other things. It was heartbreaking looking at all our memorable items all shattered or outside of the window. It was even more painful going into my room and looking at my bed, where I would have been sitting had I been home. Removing 5 bags worth of glass from my windows that exploded onto my bed created an eerie feeling in me that made me think, if I was there, those 5 bags worth of glass would have needed to be removed from my body and not the bed. The next days were full of hardships, supporting my mother through physiotherapy, comforting each other through the loss of my grandmother, and working on fixing our home, the home where I studied for all my exams, the home where I hosted all my parties with friends over the years. Is it fair that I had to live this experience? Is it fair that I have to go abroad just to feel safe and pursue a good education? Is it fair that 15-year-olds had to bury their friend because he was a victim of this explosion? These should not be concerns. The pain I and every other Lebanese person felt on August 4th when they picked up the phone and checked on their loved ones and had to listen and wait in agony to those 1, 2, or however many rings it took before they were able to hear the voices of their loved ones is a feeling no one should ever feel. The feeling of no longer being able to sleep at night when there is thunder or freaking out when there is any loud noise is a feeling no one should ever feel. The feeling of having friends scattered all across the world because any Lebanese who could afford to leave the country left tears one inside, but one must continue to fight and move forward. A month later, I packed all my things and moved to London, where until today I find tiny fragments of glass and dust in my clothes. As hard and as horrible as the experience was for me, I have to admit that it was nowhere nearly as bad as others. Because of the economic situation in Lebanon, many no longer have the means to pay for their medical bills or to repair their homes. This is why I strongly believe that change needs to happen and at many levels, such as people abroad voting for foreign policies that will put pressure on corrupt Lebanese politicians to resign and make room for qualified politicians to come and restructure. Non-Lebanese can even do actions as simple as educating themselves about the importance of what's happening in Lebanon. In the meantime, the Lebanese will continue to protest, and we will continue to work on small projects like making elections at universities an example for national elections by freeing them from religious and party shackles that have tied us back. And we will continue to push away from ideological myopia through community building activities and a more open-minded mentality that we will build together. As a student, I cannot take full credit for the resilience I have built, and I must proudly give an ode to student and youth-led movements that I am witnessing. These movements, such as BLM, have created a fire in me and keeps this fire alive and never want to give up. Yes, our dream of making the world a better place might be a cliche, but I like to think of it as we're all doing what we can in our own communities to do better. So if you're waiting for a sign to act, this is it. I'm not the face of Fridays for Future, overcoming Aspergers, fighting for a cause against some of the world's wealthiest, whose business and affluence are threatened by climate-considerate actions. However, I do believe that my experiences have enlightened me in several dimensions and have allowed me to take these experiences beyond face value. For example, job shadowing in the Lebanese Ministry of Education gave me insights into dealing with issues of catering to the educational needs of poor Lebanese students while also accommodating for refugees. I've also put the effort and gone the extra mile to understand Lebanon in the context of international organizations and humanitarian aid by shadowing the Executive Director of UNICEF and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Furthermore, my volunteering experiences with Syrian refugees, complemented by volunteering across the world such as in Laos, have pushed me towards a proactive and activist path that encourages me to go beyond my comfort zone. Simply growing up in Lebanon and traveling across the Middle East with headlines of refugees, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and many more have also been key in shaping my understanding of how it is we can work together to improve Lebanon. When you tell any Lebanese the date August 4th, they will forever remember it as the day they lost a loved one, a home, a source of income, a favorite restaurant, whatever faith they had left in the government, or a piece of their country. But I want to work so that I remember it as more than just that. And hopefully one day my work can also change the way others see it, to a day where we honor all the victims of the government's negligence, but also a turning point in Lebanese history that makes the youth more committed to work for Lebanon. I am determined to make it the start of my work for justice. Despite my grandmother's passing, I cannot give up, and I still have a responsibility to my community. I'm moving forward by working with a social enterprise that collects, sorts, and redistributes clothes to disadvantaged communities, to donate my grandmother's clothes and support Lebanon's most vulnerable. We also documented this process in a short documentary to honor her, raise awareness about the blast, and to prove to others how they can be proactive in their communities. I cannot fix the economic situation overnight and single-handedly, nor can I be the one to trial politicians, but I can make my voice heard, something rare in many Middle Eastern countries. Reaching out to independent and student-run newspapers has been the first step for me, and writing political commentaries has been the start. Working on this talk is another step that I have taken to amplify the voices and suffering of the Lebanese, because unlike many, I am fortunate enough to go abroad and have these opportunities, so it is my duty to advocate for those whose voices cannot be heard. Additionally, I have also been working in LSE as a student representative to learn more about the nuances of being a leader, to one day implement change on a greater scale. Looking ahead, I have also been coordinating with international organizations to organize a virtual bake-off to fundraise for victims of the blast. Through these experiences, I learned more and more about activism, and by sharing these experiences, I hope others can learn too. I lost a lot in the Beirut blast. It left my street smashed, my grandmother gone, and my country crying. But equally important, the blast had frontlined a sectarian system and decades of corruption. And I gained a feeling of excitement to start my journey at LSE, so I can apply my knowledge to help Lebanon recover and rebuild. I was born in the US to a Greek father and a Lebanese Egyptian Syrian mother with long spells in the UK and Greece. However, Lebanon is my home and it was broken along with my heart, but I keep going. My experiences have made me want to never give up. I know that almost anyone can give a talk about resilience in one form or another, but I strongly believe that my global upbringing, work, volunteering, and personal experiences have given me valuable insights on resilience as a teen. Telling this story, I hope to have brought a youthful face to headlines that people hear and read about Lebanon and challenge stereotypes. I hope I have motivated people to think that change starts small. I hope to inspire teenagers globally to be resilient in the face of disaster and to keep fighting to be happy, and work hard to ensure social, political, and economic justice in whichever form they may be, because effort does matter and it can go a long way. Thank you.